much of what I did was a giant monologue. So I'd stand up there and I'd give a little monologue, and then there'd be like 4 or 5 people that would say various things, ranging from "that was great" to "I would like to punch you in the face," which that is true. That actually happened to me. Um, but it wasn't. There was no dialogue, is what I was getting at. It was a series of things you lob out there. So I've already had a dialogue about what I'd like to talk about, which has already shaped what I think I'd like to talk about. So anyway, also feel quite welcome here. This sign impresses me. I don't know what it is, but I see the giant question mark, which is stirring in its own right. When I was in graduate school, a friend of mine made a brand, like what I mean, not like the kind like Nike, but a brand as in an iron rod, with a little poker thing at the end. It was very small, but it had a question mark on it. And we decided to brand all the books that we wanted to ask questions about. So I branded the Bible right in my office. So that got me going on a few things. Anyway, so yeah, I want to start with a story. Maybe it's a story you've heard before. I'm only going to tell about 6% of the story, and it's a story about a little mouse. It's a Native American story. Its origins are a little mysterious. When was it written? Who wrote it? What tribe does it belong to? I don't know any of those answers, so I'll just give you 6% of the story. So there was a little mouse, and he lived in a little mouse village. And he was really good at doing mouse things and gathering things up and staying busy. And he started noticing, though, one day that he heard a roaring in his ears. Like he thought he heard a roaring, but he wasn't quite sure at first. He's like, some kind of noise. And so he asked his other little mouse friends, "Hey, what's that noise?" And they're like, "What are you talking about? There's no noise. Get back to work." So, all right, yeah, he got back to work and went around and did more mouse things, and picked up mouse stuff, and just went around the village, but the noise wouldn't go away. He kept hearing the roaring in his ears, and he asked around. He asked old people, young people, "Do you hear that roaring?" They would say, "No, you're just trying to get out of work. You just don't want to do your job. Get back to work." But he wouldn't let it go. He wouldn't let it go. One day he had the courage to find out what this thing is. So he went to the edge of the village, and he was deathly afraid of the edge of the village because of the eagles. He looked up in the sky, and he would see the spots, and he knew if he left the village, there's a chance he could die. So it didn't matter. The roaring was so annoying to him that he said, "Enough is enough," and he went outside the village. And the first creature he met was Raccoon. Raccoon said, "Little mouse, what are you doing outside the village?" And Little Mouse was terrified at first because he didn't know if he was going to be eaten or not. Didn't know if Raccoon was friendly or not. But he said, "Look, I'm just going to tell you the truth. You're not going to believe me, but I keep hearing a roaring in my ears, and I want to find out what it is." He said, "Roaring? You hear roaring in your ears?" He said, "Yeah." He said, "I know all about the roaring. I'll show you." And so Little Mouse was super excited. He's like, "This is amazing. All my mice friends back in the mice village, whatever, but not Raccoon. Raccoon said, "It's going to be a long journey, so let's go." So they head out on this long journey. And they're going through meadows and fields and foothills and climbing mountains and coming down into valleys. And the roaring is getting louder and louder and louder. Finally, they come over this little rise, and Raccoon says, "Here it is." And he looks down, and he's never seen anything like this before. He sees a massive river just raging down in the valley below, spilling over the rocks, crashing into, all kinds. It's muddy and it's clear and there are eddies, and it's an amazing river. He's like, "This is it. This is the source of the roaring in my ears." And he takes him down to the edge of the bank, and he says, "I want to introduce you to my friend Frog. And I told you I would take you with you, and I also told you I would take you back, but I'm feeling a little hungry," Raccoon says. "I'm just going to go for lunch, but Frog will take care of you." So Mouse is a little afraid again. He's looking at the frog, and the frog says, "Hey, would you like some medicine?" And Little Mouse says, "Yeah." He's like, "Okay, I'll tell you, But before I tell you, I need you to crouch down on the ground as low as you can. Just crouch down on the ground as low as you can. And then I want you to jump as high as you're able. Little mouse says, this is kind of strange medicine, but he's worried because he's afraid he'll never make it back to the village without this medicine. So he does it. He crouches down as low as he's able, and he jumps as high as he can. And at the very top of his jump, he surprises himself, and he realizes, wow, I didn't know I could jump. And he kind of comes over the tree line, and he sees in the distance the sacred mountains. And he thought the sacred mountains were just a story. He thought they didn't exist. And he gets a glimpse of the sacred mountain, but his trajectory is slightly off, and he lands in the river instead of back on the bank. And he gets pulled all the way down to the bottom, and he's getting tumbled about, and he's smashing into rocks. And just about at the moment he's going to die, he pops out and lands on the shore. And he comes out and he's cussing, whatever mice say when they're really angry. And he's mad at Frog. He's like, "What? You nearly killed me. What are you doing? This is not medicine." He's like, wait. Before you dismiss me, what did you see? He says, "Well, you're not going to believe this, but I saw a glimpse of the sacred mountains." He's like, "Yeah, you saw a glimpse of the sacred mountains, and I'm going to give you a new name. Your new name is Jumping Mouse. And you can make it back to the village. Just walk away from the roaring in the ears. And as it gets quieter, you'll eventually find the village." So he goes back home. This part of it, I'll shorten it. I promise you, this is 6% of the story. I know it sounds long. He gets back to the village. He's all wet, and no one will talk to him. He's poisoned now. They think he's been picked up by a wolf or a coyote because he's all wet. And the coyote or wolf must have spit the mouse out, because you don't walk around as a wet mouse unless you're full of poison. So we'll pause the story there. So this story has been working on me over the last couple years, along with a number of other stories. And the theme that I'd like to just point out has to do with leaving home. Because it's very obvious, little mouse leaves home. He also gets a new name and comes back home. So that you've got this component too. And by the way, if you want to know the rest of the percentage of the story, 94%, he has to leave again, but we'll leave that for now. So anyway, he's got to leave home. And I've been thinking about that notion, leaving home. What's that mean? And I went to graduate school for sort of biblical studies, religious studies. And the stories, particularly of the Hebrew Bible, have a very interesting pattern. Like, let's take the main story of Abraham. All right? The very first thing that's said to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12 is, leave your land, or your country, leave your country. Leave your land, your people, okay, and your father's household. So country, land, leave your country, leave your people, and leave your father. Now, those three things make up what we would call, in contemporary language, our identity markers. How else do you know who you are? You know it by your country and the borders of your country, and not to make a political statement, but you know it by, and your people. Who are your people? And of course, your family of origin, your father's house, in a more patriarchal sort of society. And you would not have the story of Abraham if he didn't leave. There would be no story. He'd be like, nah, I'll stay. I'm good. We got it good here. I've got a flat screen TV or whatever. I'm just going to chill here. And it's kind of a long journey. And plus, you didn't even tell me where to go, which is true in the story. It just says leave. It doesn't say where. So there, in other words, there's no story of the Hebrew Bible. There's no story of the Jewish people without that leaving home. Now, you can say, which is a more literalist, fundamentalist reading or something like that. What if you ask, what's the point of the story? The point of the story is that happened once to Abraham. Now, that's not the point of the story. There's something else. Something happens in our growing up, in our human makeup, that the story is communicating. In other words, it's telling us something about what's true in life. You wouldn't say of the jumping mouse story, well, what's true about that? It's true that it happened. I highly doubt if a little mouse went and talked to a raccoon and a frog. Maybe. I could be wrong. So that's just the story of Abraham. What other stories do we have about leaving? We have Jacob. He cheats his brother and has to leave home. And on the way out, he's running for his life. He has a strange dream. And his life begins to, some mystery starts meddling with his life. You got the story of Jonah, which is very clear. Go to Nineveh, he says no, and he leaves and goes in the opposite direction. And there'd be no story, there'd be no transformation of Jonah if he just said, okay, that sounds fine, I'll do whatever you say, God, because I'm a good little boy, I'm a good little prophet, I'm going to do what you say. But he says no instead and leaves and tries to run away, and now you have a story. You don't have a story without leaving home. So that's what I've been thinking about. What does it mean to leave home? That's what we were talking about at the 9 o'clock gathering. What does it mean to leave home? What about Jesus? Well, at age 12, you have that story where he leaves his family, his mom and dad, and he stays in his father's house in Jerusalem. And his family's like, what? Where are you? Okay. That's the beginning. That's something stirring in Jesus. Jesus hears the roaring in the ears when he's 12. Otherwise, he would just be a good little boy and do what Mary and Joseph, whatever they were doing. But he hears the roaring in his ears. He's so curious about the roaring in his ears that he says, I'm going to leave my family. Now he comes back, except when he's 30, then he really leaves home. And he goes out into the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights. He goes, what's another leaving home story? The story of the Exodus. Leaving Egypt, going into the wilderness. These are all leaving stories. So Jesus does the same thing. He recapitulates the Exodus narrative and he leaves his family. And by the way, when he goes into the wilderness, I think in contemporary language, I think this is fine to say, and discovers who he is or something of his story or his soul out in the wilderness, he comes back home to Nazareth and he's dripping wet and people think he's poisoned, like in the mouse story, so to speak. I'm getting really excited because I never thought about this connection. But he comes back home and they try to drive him out. And in the Gospel of Luke it says, and he never goes back home again. So you'd have no story of Jesus if he was just like a good boy. Good little Jesus being a nice guy wearing a bathrobe and talking to children. You'd have no story. And then the teachings of Jesus. I thought, by the way, you experienced something very unique this morning. You heard a Mary Oliver poem followed by a very unusual teaching of Jesus. Let the dead bury the dead. Those two things have never probably been said in close proximity. So someone wants to follow Jesus. He's like, I want to follow you. And Jesus says, all right. He's like, but first I have a funeral I need to attend. He's like, I'll let the dead bury the dead. Now, that is not nice guy Jesus, right? We think, I thought you were supposed to be like the nice guy. But do you hear that behind that is also the question of leaving home? He has to say, I have to go home and bury my father. And Jesus is saying in sort of a very unusual way, do you want to leave or not? And he just sort of leaves it at that. Doesn't really tell him what to do. By the way, Jesus has another one. He says, unless you hate your mother and father, you cannot be my disciple. Now, I bet you've never heard folks on the family use that one, have you? Okay. By the way, my last name is Dobson. I'm not related to folks on the family people, but you're not going to put that on a bumper sticker, Family values. Hate your mom and dad. Okay. But Jesus is saying, I don't know exactly what he's saying. I'd like to ask him. But there is a component of leaving home. You can hear that in such a teaching. Are you going to wander out beyond the confines of the village where it's scary and you might meet a raccoon or there might be eagles or you might be asked to crouch as low as you can or jump as high as you're able, which I heard, by the way, in your little liturgy. I heard a hint of such a thing. At times, a heart full of joy lifting you to the sky, above the tree line, getting a glimpse of the sacred mountains. And then at other times, pressing you to the earth, crouching as low as you can, down to the earth. That's a human being coming fully alive, I think. So one time, I was giving a sermon, I'll talk about the roaring in my own ears just a little bit. And if you really want to, there's also, you can talk back to me at 11:15 and say whatever you want. We can have a conversation. So anyway, one time I was walking around on a stage just like this, all right? So I'm walking around like this. And actually it sounded like this. It's kind of, and something very odd happened to me. I had what I would call a sort of out-of-body experience as I was walking around, talking like I'm doing now. I'm not having it now, by the way. But I was walking around, and there were a lot of people. This is when, this is in megachurch land, so there are people all over, like in the round, like this, thousands of people. I'm walking around, and I could hear myself teaching. And I thought to myself, who is that talking? That was the feeling I had. Who is that talking right now? Now, which also made me freak out inside, but I had to finish the sermon. And I would say this lasted really until I stopped. I could see myself almost from above talking. Who is that? What is that person talking about? Who is that talking? That was the experience I had. So naturally, I panicked and freaked out and talked to my therapist about it. And this was a number of years ago. But what I would say is that I was starting to hear a new roaring in my own ears that I started to get curious about. I started to get curious about this. Who is this person who gives sermons and gives little spiritual talks? Is that Kent? Maybe that's the answer right there. Is that Kent talking? Who is that talking? Now, one way of assuring that I never found out is if I just stayed in the village. Don't pay any attention to that freaky Sunday. We'll put it behind us, and we'll get up there and we'll give a rousing sermon next week, which is largely what I did for a while. But I just kept asking that question. In other words, I began to hear a roaring in my ears. In other words, there's something about who we are that's beneath the surface. Correct? You are not a role, even a last name or a first name or a family of origin, or there's something that is beneath that stuff. I would call that the soul. You might use other language. Something that is uniquely you, that somehow you feel out of contact with. And unless you venture on the larger journey, sometimes you don't find out very much about it. You don't find out very much about what that is. And in a religious setting, which I don't know what this is, you can tell me later. Most religious settings, traditional religious settings, try to keep people from leaving the village at all costs. Don't leave the village because eagles are going to come and they're going to attack you. But every once in a while, people get the courage that the roaring in the ears gets loud enough that they venture outside the village and they meet a raccoon. The raccoon says, "You're not crazy." Maybe that's what you're doing here. People are coming out of the village and you're there to say, "You're not crazy. Come on down to the river and have a different kind of baptism where you nearly drowned, but you also see a glimpse of the sacred mountains." I don't know. So if this is true, or true enough, what I'm trying to say, and I would also call this maybe just in a more simple way, growing up. You don't grow up very easily unless there's a leaving home. And sometimes it's very physical. Sometimes it's obvious. We talked about at 9, sometimes it's not even something that you do. Sometimes you get kicked out of the village. You don't fit in. You have you have a weird tail or something in a way, you're not one of us and you get sent out. And then you really start some serious wandering. So sometimes it's choice and sometimes maybe it's not so much of a choice. But just to name some things that maybe keep us from wanting to leave, things like your roles, especially if you're successful. Success is a twisted bitter. Let me be more direct. Success often blocks us from going on what I'd call the further journey. If you are a really big mouse in the village, you don't really want to leave. You know, if you're already on the edges and people don't like you and you have a tiny house or something, you're more apt to say, there's got to be something else. But anyway, so your roles, the things that you worked really hard at achieving, climbing ladders, getting to the top of, like, imagine if you got to the top of sort of evangelical Christian world and you had your own mega church. And I don't know anybody like this, but they get to the very top and they have a mega church and a captive audience. But then at the very top, you're not sure what's going on. You're like, wait, how did I end up here? It's very hard then to say, I think I'll leave. Because success has a way of keeping you stuck. So your roles, things that you identify with strongly, your family, of course, your family says you're going to die, if you leave us, or you're going to burn in hell or something like that if it's religious. So don't go. Whatever you do, don't go. And more than that, we don't even like you the way you are. So not only should you stay, but you have to change who you are in order to stay. So there's also that. Even stories we cling to about ourselves, the way you talk about yourself, I am this, I'm that. The stories that have shaped you. Not that those stories are untrue, but sometimes our own way of telling our stories keeps us stuck in some way.